All right, Andrew, on today's show, we are interviewing the 5-time Emmy-award-winning and New York Times best-selling author and investigative journalist by the name of Sharyl Attkisson. Andrew, I want to do a quick survey. How many Emmys have you won?
As of right now, 0.
So you and I are tied.
Yeah.
Right. So this lady's kind of a big deal. And on today's show, this investigative journalist joins us to share why you are being labeled as a conspiracy theorist simply for sharing the truth. And she shares about how the news media has taught us to embrace censorship. It's almost like we love censorship because we're so used to it. And when anybody shares the actual truth with us, we just label them as a conspiracy theorist because we're so used to the omission, the intentional misinformation, the chronic misreporting, the slanting, the mass manipulation of our minds by the mainstream media. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have been under the suspicion that the media has been lying to you, today is the show for you. Our interview with the 5-time Emmy Award-winning and New York Times best-selling author, Sharyl Atkinson.
Some shows don't need a celebrity narrator to introduce the show, but this show does. 2 men, 8 kids, co-created by 2 different women, 13 multi-million-dollar businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Thrive Time Show.
3, 2, 1, here we go!
Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, and we'll show you how to get here. Started from the bottom, now we here. We started from the bottom, now we here. We started from the bottom, now we here. We started from the bottom, now we'll show you how to get here.
Yes, and yes. Thrive Nation, I know that many of you are carving this crazy thing called truth. You turn on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, CNN, wherever you get your news from, and many of you have started to discover that it appears as though the media has an agenda. Many of you have known for years that the media does have an agenda. And so I thought, let's reach out to somebody who has lived in her entire working career in the media and who now has irrefutable proof that the media is giving you a slanted perspective of the truth. Sharyl Atkinson, welcome on to the Thrive Time Show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Sharyl, you are a multiple-time New York Times best-selling author back when that meant something. So you are very much part of the media. You've seen the media. But before we get into your what's going on with the media corruption today, I wanted to ask you, where did you come from? What was your life like growing up as a kid?
Well, before I talk about childhood, you reminded me when you introduced me the way you did that I used to work at CNN, by the way, when it was a news organization.
What?
So I've been at CNN, CBS, PBS, and local news. And my upbringing was just sort of a regular old family in Sarasota, Florida, one of 4 kids. And I think I knew very little about politics even after I graduated from college. Maybe that's kind of what makes me a neutral person entering the political field. When I do my stories, I don't really have a vested interest. But I have a keen sense of fairness. I love to write. And those things turned out to be good for investigative journalism.
When did it occur to you, you know what, I want to be a professional journalist? When did that light bulb go off for you?
When I was in college, we all want to be a lawyer, a psychologist our first year in college. And then the second year when you have to redeclare your major, I didn't know what to do. And someone told me she was going into journalism school, which I happened to be in a college, University of Florida, that had a top journalism school. And I didn't even know what that was. This is a long time ago, back in 1980, 79. And I decided to go into journalism because she told me it's all about writing, and that's what I love to do most.
Now, so you get out of school. I'm sure you had the highest expectations for your career. The future couldn't be brighter when you graduated college there. What was your first job outside of college?
WTVX, the CBS station in West Palm Beach, Florida, in a pretty big small market. It was really a starter station, even though it was market size 63. They number them 1 for New York City all the way to the smaller market, several hundred. But I learned how to, be a good reporter there, produce, edit, everything, and make all my mistakes with a fairly small audience, which is good. You learn your
Yeah.
Get your chops in place. You're not at the national news making important mistakes. Your local news hopefully making relatively small mistakes. And then from there I went to Columbus, Ohio local news, Tampa, Florida local news, and then CNN.
So you went to Columbus. If you went from Columbus, Ohio, and then where was the next stop before CNN?
Tampa, Florida, WTBX, which was a CBS station back then.
Okay. Now, working for CNN, you would have been there in what years at CNN?
1989 or 90 to 93, back when we wouldn't have dreamed of inserting our opinion in a summary of the president's speech or in anything. It just was a whole different animal back then.
So let's talk about this. When did you realize that the media was changing and becoming less interested in hard facts and more focused on spinning a narrative?
Well, this revelation happened to me, I would say 2003, 4, 5. But I was still doing some great journalism at CBS at the time, had great bosses. They wanted, terrific original stories. But I did see the encroachment of the industry I call the smear industry that became increasingly effective. These are political interests, corporate interests who understood how to start getting the news to slant their reporting, to stop certain stories, which we now know that fairly commonly today, but that was unheard of around the 2005 time period, that someone wouldn't just want their side heard, but would say, don't even air that story. Don't even let the public hear that viewpoint because it's so bad or dangerous or wrong. That was a new concept. And that was a moment in time for me that was like, who would want you not to hear the story at all? And that became increasingly common. They became increasingly influential with figuring out how to go through the corporate side of the news, or go through your colleagues, or go through your bosses, or go through social media and smear and discredit you or the story. And I just saw that really accelerate in the 2012, 13, 14 time period. And I quit CBS ahead of my contract in 2014 because it just got to be so bad. We were so intertwined with these special interests that I had different bosses then, some of which wanted not the truth reported anymore. In fact, if you told them what was really happening, they didn't want it. They wanted the stories to read exactly how I've written, like little novels in their mind. They wanted them to come out that way regardless of the truth, and it got to be an untenable situation.
Did you, does that come from I think a lot of our listeners aren't familiar with the way a newsroom works, but as a journalist, who tells you can't run a story?
Well, for most of my career, nobody did. There were just maybe a few exceptions, but this is what changed, where I would say I was a little different as an investigative reporter. I didn't go through the normal editorial process at CBS. I went straight to the top bosses to have my stories vetted and approved, and I put all my stories to the CBS legal department, which they told me I'm the only reporter that regularly did that voluntarily. And I had producers that would approve, that I worked with, that would go up the chain to New York, that would look at the script and approve it. And by the time it got to that stage, they always wanted the story because my stories were investigative in nature. Now, there would be a time when maybe you're doing what they call a day of air story. So in between the investigative, they need you to run out to the airport and do a live shot about X, Y, or Z. And they may not have time for that day. They always have more stories going than they have time for at the end of the day. That's common, and that's not what I'm talking about when I say slanting the news. Your stories are killed all the time for reasons of time and, other factors. But my stories and many other correspondent stories, they started getting shaped to a point of lack of recognition and not being truthful and honest in my view. And then if you wouldn't shape them, they never said, oh, we're not going to air this story because you won't put this false information. And they would just say, we don't have time to. That's a great story. In fact, they would almost compliment it, like over-compliment it and say, maybe tomorrow. Like, we don't have time today, but that's so good. And it would die what I call the death of 1,000 cuts. It would just never air. They would never say, or rarely say, we're never going to air it. They would just say, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, and then it would just never. And you knew, like, as a reporter, you sense these patterns and you know what's going on.
And I hate to belabor this point, but I want to make sure the listeners know this. When you're a journalist and you're getting somebody slow playing your story or refusing to air it or passively aggressively giving it a death by a million paper cuts, who's doing that? I'm not looking for a specific name, but I mean in the org chart, who blocks your stories?
Well, for me, it was the executive producer primarily that took over the CBS Evening News and Scott Pelley, who was managing editor at the time, and they had a clear agenda of some kind, and I don't think it was always clear and easy to say what it was. It's not as simple as saying it's a left-wing agenda, which a lot of people say. Yes, there's some of that, but there are also other interests at play, like the pharmaceutical industry and just all kinds of things. So there were people prior to this time that would try to intervene and kill certain stories, because when I do investigative reporting, you know, you tend to be perceived as going after powerful interests, and they want to weigh in on what you're doing, and they find ways to try to stop it. There's a whole industry in that. But I was always successful prior to this point. My bosses didn't succumb to that. They understood that that was part of what happened, but we would still air our fair and accurate stories. But during this time period that I'm talking about, they started shaping the stories, saying what they had to say ahead of time, not airing them. So they were the ones that had the power to not schedule it. They're the ones that put the, make the daily rundown, as they call it. And your story may be in there, and then you watch as the day goes on, and it just slips out. Just goes away from the rundown and may never go back in.
I was on CNN with Ann Cohen, I believe is her last name. And she was asking me early on about COVID-19. And she says, the story is, why are you deciding to keep your businesses open? And I pointed out, well, the models that said that 2.2 million people might die, those models have been funded by the Gates and people, Bill Gates, and then also by the Amazon folks. And the organization's called the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute. And it turned out they were wrong by 25 times. And the PCR tests are falsely calibrated, so it produces an inflated number of COVID-19 cases. And right when I got to that point, she goes, "You are a business owner, right?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." And then she's like, "Well, Clay," and then she starts almost attacking me, and then they hang up. And I'm going, what was that? I mean, does somebody give somebody like a message in their earpiece, or how does that work?
Well, that's hard to say, but, it could be an accident, but it also could be somebody that, yes, pulls the plug on an interview when you're saying these things that they've agreed for whatever reasons, because special interests work in their newsrooms now. We're not even separate anymore. I write about this in my new book, Slanted. We've invited them into our newsrooms. We're not even just being influenced by them. They work with us now.
Wow.
And they're making editorial decisions. They're reporters and producers and analysts. So, we're kind of one and the same. And I think that explains why certain views and science is not allowed to be heard. And that when they're wrong, which is so often the case, and I have a list of over 130 really important media mistakes in the era of Trump made by the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, ABC, you name it, all these supposedly big players who are fact-checking the rest of us. And nobody is held accountable in general for these huge mistakes. I mean, there should have been an industry-wide examination after the Trump-Russia collusion false stories and narratives that circulated for 2 years, and there wasn't, because their mission was accomplished. I tell people you have to think of the goal of many of today's so-called journalists is not to tell the truth. It's quite the opposite. It's to spin a narrative and try to sway public opinion. So even when they're wrong, and knowingly wrong or proven wrong in the end, they're not sorry, because they're not journalists in the traditional sense. They're propagandists, and they still got their point across, and they still did exactly what they were trying to do.
Now,
that's the only thing that explains this dynamic.
What I want to do is I want to go 90 miles an hour, if I can, now into your new book, Slanted, because the book is powerful. And in the book, you really dive deep, but I wanted to, if I could, kind of unpack 4 big ideas that I found in the book. And then I had a couple listeners who are here in the studio that had a few questions for you, because people for years have just gone to the media, and we trust the mainstream media blindly. So in your book, Slanted, you do talk about the misreporting of Black Lives Matter, about Black Lives Matter. How would you describe the misreporting going on about Black Lives Matter, the organization, not the phrase, but the actual organization itself?
Well, I would say in general, we just got this one-sided version wherever you were looking. We got either that this was a, bad, violent, riot, terrorist type organization, or we got that, you all are crazy to say that. There is no violence. They're totally peaceful. And we were not able to discuss on the news, it seemed to me, in a logical and reasoned way, the actual case, which is, I think, clearly showed, I think people at home know this, There are bad actors, violent people, people trying to manipulate others and stoke these divisions. And there's certainly also peaceful protesters who really believe what they're marching about and talking about and have a genuine interest in, making constructive changes. But it was as if you had to take sides, one or the other, and that's pretty much what you heard on the news. So it almost divides everybody along. It plays into that division along these lines of either one side or the other, good, bad, left, right. And most issues, quite frankly, aren't exactly like that. But that's how the news portrays them on a regular basis. And I attribute some of that to the fact that we have analysts, so many analysts. If you read my book, my colleagues that I interviewed, I think this is one of the most unique things about the book, talking about the death of the news. They all cited these panels and the analysts as one of the worst things that's happened to the news. And now when there's any breaking news event, because we're paying these political analysts six figures to be sitting there at the ready at all times, every news event immediately becomes politicized because something happens, the news anchor turns to the right and turns to the left, and there's Donna Brazile, and there's Karl Rove, and of course their lens is, as propagandists, they view everything through political terms, so the event is automatically politicized, and you can't have this sort of rational discussion.
I have a friend of mine who, or acquaintance of mine, I should say, I've met through different entrepreneurial endeavors I've had, and one night I watched one of the stories that she ran in Tulsa. And I called her afterwards, and I'm like, did you really research that? I mean, what's your thoughts on that? And she said, I don't know. I mean, it was on the prompter. We have a team that vets all that. And I'm going, what? And that was probably, 5-6 years ago. I mean, I was shocked that this person hadn't looked up anything themselves. It was almost like she's an actress at this point. And I think it's really scary. So if you're listening right now and you go to timetofreeamerica.com, timetofreeamerica.com, you can click on the link and you can see the funding of who's funding the organization Black Lives Matter, or you can pick up the book Slanted. And when you get the book Slanted, Cheryl goes so deep in her research, it's going to be mind-blowing for you. Now, Cheryl, let's talk about the media misleading America about COVID-19, which is why I got kicked off of CNN. Could you talk about this COVID-19 and the misreporting that is going on right now as it relates to the China virus called COVID-19?
It's rampant, the misreporting, and at the highest levels. The New York Times is one of the guiltiest parties, the Washington Post. They contradict themselves. They contradict each other. And we're supposed to pretend none of that's happening, I guess, and not ask the logical questions. And if you ask the most rationed logical questions, you're going to be controversialized if they're off whatever the narrative is, if they're working for perhaps a pharmaceutical interest or a government/pharmaceutical interest that wants a certain storyline out. If you ask a question that's off that narrative, they're going to attack you personally, meaning the news organizations. This is a relatively new development. They act as smear operators to attack other journalists who are not on what they see as the proper narrative, whole industry in that now too. And when you mentioned your reporter friend saying something she didn't know anything about, coronavirus is a perfect example of reporters should not, this should never be the case where they, who have not researched this in a scientific lab themselves, should be telling people what, to believe. In other words, get the vaccine. It didn't come from the lab. Whatever the narrative is, the most they should be saying is, these officials say that you should get the vaccine. Public health officials say the virus was not engineered in a lab. They can't say themselves, but this has turned into this whole, I don't know if this sounds like a tiny distinction to your audience, but this stuff has to be attributed. The reporter doesn't know any of this happened. The reporter doesn't know that any of this is the case, and yet they're making these proclamations as if they have done the firsthand scientific research, which is a very dangerous thing because they were saying, remember, don't wear masks. They weren't saying public health officials are saying that masks are not effective. They were saying you're unpatriotic if you don't wear masks as a firsthand, as if they've done the scientific research. So the misreporting has been rampant. If you ask the logical question about did the coronavirus come from the Wuhan lab, which, by the way, that question floated away and nobody ever resolved, and I'm working on that right now. But the intelligence agencies said that they were investigating that likelihood, and there were cables that the Washington Post reported from the State Department that showed they warned a year in advance after examining that lab where U.S. funding went that there could be a pandemic with a bat coronavirus slipping over into the human population and causing a global pandemic. This was foretold, so certainly it's a very logical question to ask. Did this was this sort of an engineered thing they were experimenting with in the lab? But if you say the most rational question, you're to be controversialized as a tinfoil hat conspiratorialist, because I believe the powerful interests that know the truth don't want people probing in that direction, and they try to, I guess the term is gaslight you into thinking you can't even ask that question. Oh, that's been debunked and you're crazy to think it, when in fact it's actually the most, to me, rational question based on the evidence to be asked so far.
You know, it's very interesting, but if anybody listening right now, if you were to do a Google search or a DuckDuckGo search for the phrase gain of function research, you will see on the NIH website that gain of function research is a research where you manipulate viruses in the lab to explore their potential for infecting humans. Translation, you take a naturally occurring virus from a mouse or a bat and you mix it with human tissue and you see what happens. Now, we know Newsweek even reported this. It's crazy. I mean, Cheryl, Newsweek even reported that Dr. Fauci funded the controversial Wuhan lab with U.S. dollars. And Rudy Giuliani, Navarro, there's been a few bold people that have asked the idea, why is the man leading the coronavirus task force, why is the man who is leading the task force potentially the man that funded the creation of it? And when you ask those questions, it immediately gets erased from the media. My good friend Lynn Wood, every time Lynn Wood is on a media outlet and he brings up any hard questions, as an attorney, he just asks tough questions. They try to silence him. And in your book, Slanted, I mean, if you want to talk about media bias, if you have someone in your family that says, you're just a conspiracy theorist, you got to get the book Slanted, because that book is going to be able to allow you to communicate just how slanted the media is. Cheryl, let's talk about Joe Biden. I mean, we have all sorts of irrefutable evidence coming out of the Ukraine, coming out of Hunter's laptop, coming out of affidavits, showing that he and his son have a lot of connections to China, that very same China that is our biggest security threat. What does America need to know about Joe Biden and the misleading or the misinformation being reported by the mainstream media?
Well, let me be clear. I haven't done as deep of an investigation as Politico, which is a left-leaning press, first exposed this. People forgot about a year ago, kind of went off the radar. And I haven't done as deep an investigation as some of the others who have reported on the details, but I have done some investigating into this topic. And I will tell you that, you know, there's something I call the substitution game. I use that in my books. I think people do this intuitively. They just don't call it that. Obviously, if there were these kinds of connections and questions and a laptop and the alleged drug use and the financial dealings with communist China and so on in the Trump side, you know, the media would be going wild with headlines. It would never stop internationally, day after day after day, true or not. That's just how it would be. So I think we all know intuitively the fact that the FBI has had the Hunter Biden laptop and kept it secret, whereby everything about Trump, even false information, seems to leak out if it's bad for Trump, but nothing leaks out if it's bad for, you know, another political side. I think that hypocrisy really undermines the trust people have in, you know, our law enforcement bodies. And the press just is oddly uncurious and unskeptical about the very same things they would be going to town after if it were the Trump family. So I think there are legitimate questions to be asked about the Bidens. Now, there's nothing wrong inherently with contacts with China, just on its face, just like millions of Americans have contacts and business dealings in Russia. And that was, you know, people didn't understand. It seemed like sometimes that's been commonplace for many, many years. In fact, the U.S. government encouraged business with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's nothing inherently suspicious about that. And if you do business, by the way, in Russia, you're going to have contact with federal, their government agents, because that's how it works there. Unknowingly or not, you deal with these people. And China may be much the same. So there's nothing inherently wrong on its face. But in the case of the Hunter Biden scenario, there are many questions to be asked about conflicts of interest, undisclosed conflicts of interest and ties, the fact that there was very good testimony, true or not, but that needed to be explored, that Joe Biden, you know, was involved in perhaps profiting greatly off of these deals that were being conducted and mediated, negotiated by his son and other contacts. There are questions to be had about, you know, if at the same time Joe Biden is pushing policy on fossil fuels, saying that America, sounds to me like, needs to dial back on its fossil fuel production, but his son is closing deals that actually work with fossil fuel companies in our competing nations, $1 million and billion-dollar deals. That's something that needs to be looked into and disclosed. And then the whole Ukrainian scenario. What we know, the Ukrainian scenario is far more explicit than what they accused Donald Trump of doing or proved that Donald Trump did, and yet there's no similar curiosity or attempt to prosecute, the Bidens for the very same thing.
We have a guest here with us by the name of Nace Roberts. He runs a machine shop called Master Machine. They make parts for the U.S. military, for Tesla, and other organizations and companies. And Nace had a question. He wanted to ask you about how the media is slanting our perspective of what is true. So, Nace, meet Cheryl. Cheryl, meet Nace.
Hey, Cheryl. How are you doing?
It's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, so censorship is a real thing, and then people call us conspiracy theorists because we see it happening. And one example, my brother and I have seen this happen. We actually have a men's grooming lounge, and it's we try to promote something on Instagram. But the reason why they wouldn't let us promote it is because we had an American flag. And so that did hurt our business because we can't do promotions because we support America. So censorship is a real thing. So my question to you, for all the people that are listening, if censorship is a real thing, where can these people go to get the facts?
Well, if you're talking about from a news standpoint, in the last chapter of my book, I think we're in a sort of a shift in time. There's no easy answer to that question. But in this interim period, I've listed individual reporters that I think you can look at, not just for fair news, and there's some in there that I don't know where they stand politically, and I like that, such as David Martin at CBS. So for national security and Pentagon issues, I look to him. Pete Williams is also well regarded at NBC. I took names of people that my colleagues suggested, and I put those in there. And I also included news organizations, and some of them left and right. Why did I do that if they're clearly partisan? Well, they're reporting off-narrative news. And I think right now we want to see the uncensored version of stories and views and scientific studies that we can't get anymore. So sometimes you have to go left or right. And one example of that is Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept. But some of you may know, if you follow this issue very closely, he's a left-leaning reporter that started the company The Intercept just for the purpose of making sure powerful interests in government, we're not censoring all the news. He recently had to quit his own news organization because, yes, he's from the left, but he investigated the Hunter Biden story, and they wouldn't publish it. He quit his own news organization. This is how serious and dangerous this has become. And he's now doing some independent news, but he's someone to look to, in my view, for off-narrative reporting, very good on topics we're talking about today, such as freedom of the press and censorship of, viewpoints and so on. So I just think what you have to do, and it's time-consuming and it's not a good answer, but for now you just have to find people you trust on certain issues at certain outlets, and kind of fidget around and look for the news. Or if you have even more time, I would suggest going to the original source yourself. I try to watch hearings in their full on C-SPAN or news conferences in their context on C-SPAN, and almost every time I do, my takeaway from the news is different than what I'd heard on the news, and I think that's really chilling too. So this is just, I think something better will come of all this down the road, but in the meantime, you have to find people you trust on certain issues.
Now, Jordan Roberts here, he is the brother of Nace. You're also an owner of the machine shop. What's a question that you would have, or what's the question you have for Cheryl?
Yeah, Cheryl, you partly answered my question, but as someone who has won several Emmy Awards for being an investigative journalist, I believe you know how to find the truth through all the chaos, through the agendas, and through the darkness. With most of the mainstream media being owned by a handful of people, I hear the same thing being regurgitated from one network to the next. How should we go about finding the truth for ourselves?
Let me just say briefly, I haven't looked into the consolidation of the media, and you may be right, but I don't see that as the big problem. The reason the media all reports the same thing, in my view, doesn't have to do with the ownership as much as, if you read my last book, The Smear, there are organized political and corporate interests and operatives who work in our newsroom, and they figured out how to put out a storyline, a set of talking points, a narrative and to circulate this on social media and to get nonprofits that they run that sound very innocent, but they're actually under the same umbrella as this political interest or corporation, to get them talking about it. Groups like Media Matters, which people mistakenly think is a watchdog group, is actually a propaganda left-wing group started by David Brock. They start talking about it. The Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, they issue a press release. Well, guess what? Media Matters was controlling them at the same time that they were running that nonprofit as well. All, a relatively small handful of players are inundating the information landscape with the same narratives and so-called news, and they're in the news, and then the news picks up these few stories, and they use the terms and the propaganda that they're supposed to use, and it all works very nicely for them, unless you're an off-narrative reporter that does your own thinking, and they will come after you and try to make sure you don't have a place to work if you're not going to give the message the way they want it delivered. So again, to your question, I would suggest if you can, look at a copy of Slanted at your library, if nothing else, read that last chapter, and I think it'll give you some ideas in there of where to go for the time being. And then a plug for my own, because this is exactly what I do. I have a Sunday TV program that does off-narrative factual reporting like it used to be, called Full Measure. You can find that if you don't have a TV station that runs it. You can watch it right now at fullmeasure.news, and it'll be that kind of reporting I think you're looking for.
Cheryl, I have one final question for you, then I'll give you the last word here. I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm a business owner that has a podcast, and we have millions of listeners, and occasionally people started asking more and more questions like, how can I open my business? That kind of thing. So I thought, let's talk about COVID. Let's talk about the issues of the day. People are asking me, what do I do when people are looting my company? So somehow we've become this pseudo-political show. But I was doing my research, and there is no way that you were working at CNN during the time that you described, because you appear to be 35 based upon my Google search of you.
I'll be 60 this month.
No way. You said 1980. I was born in 1980, and I'm going, there's no way. I did my research. It appears as though another Sharyl Attkisson followed the timeline that you're discussing. So, folks, do your own research. Look her up. There's no way she's 60. So, Cheryl, what's the final thing you want to share with the listeners? We have so many listeners that are action-oriented, and I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of your new book, Slanted. So many of our listeners say, Clay, what do I need to do? How can I support? Where do I need to go? What would you say to our listeners?
All right, there's a couple of things. I'll leave you with a slight hope.
Yes.
First of all, before that, you matter. Don't let them get away with it. When you go on social media, and I talk about this in Slanted, it's an entirely controlled environment now by these same interests, made to look like, people feel a certain way, and you're an outlier, and you're crazy if you don't feel the same way, made to silence and bully you. Don't let it work. Find another way to be sure you call them out on it. Don't be bullied into silence. Say how you feel. This is America. Call them out as propagandists when they're doing that. Call them out on false information, even if they use these propaganda terms against you, such as conspiracy theorists and tinfoil hat. Just use your cognitive dissonance. Talk to your friends. Live outside that box of the internet where the real world is. You get a much better picture, obviously, of what's really happening, not the picture they're trying to portray on the news and in social media. And on the plus side, whether you like Donald Trump or not, the fact that 11 million more people voted or 12 million more people voted for him than last time, despite nearly all of the media telling people not to vote for him, that he was the worst thing that ever happened on the planet, shows you that 75 million people don't listen to the narrative. And I think that's a really positive thing, however you look at it, that they're listening to this and they're dismissing it, and they understand what's going on. So there's a lot of people out there like you, if you're not buying all of these narratives and the fake reporting. And I think there will be a way for those voices to be better heard, for the news to be a little bit more like it used to be, or information, it's now so censored online, but I think there will be new technologies. There's people trying to figure out how to create platforms where that can't be done. Support those, look for them, and, don't give up. I think we're sort of at a turning point where when it sort of becomes a joke that they're labeling even a one-word tweet that President Trump tweets the word true, and they label it, this election claim is being disputed. Right. It's almost funny. If you can laugh at it and use these labels as a signal that, hey, maybe what's being said isn't false, it's actually true, and that's why they're labeling it, and kind of use it against them, then I think their method becomes ineffective.
Folks, if you're out there, I'm just telling you, I have one guy in my office. He actually put a link to the CDC website that was showing that there isn't really an exponential increase in the number of deaths this year. There's just not a massive increase in deaths, but the number of flu deaths have gone down, heart attack deaths have gone down, the pneumonia deaths. He just put a link to the CDC website and put interesting, and they blocked it as misinformation. But it's just craziness. And I just encourage you, if you're out there today, check out the new book by Sharyl Attkisson, Slanted. And Cheryl, thank you for fighting so hard for America, and thank you for making the poor life choices needed to agree to be on our show.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm glad that you and your listeners are interested in this, and I know that's going to help everybody, the fact that that people aren't giving up.
Amen. Have a great day.
You too.
And now, without any further ado, 3, 2, 1, boom!